everybody. Admiral Murphy here, bringing you my number one Star Trek show out of the Star Trek franchise. Should be pretty obvious if you've been watching all the other videos what that is. Plus, if you click the video, I tell you anyway. It is Star Trek Deep Space Nine. This is the show not only that I think made me a Star Trek fan as much as I am, because I'm at this crazy fanatic level in some ways, some people might say, but it also just made me a fan of science fiction in general. This was the show I think that inspired a lot of my creativity and storytelling and just fascination with space and all that stuff, because it had interesting characters, interesting designs, interesting stories. It's just a really great series. I know a lot of people, it isn't their favorite. A lot of people who really enjoyed Next Gen when they first saw Deep Space Nine, they're like, oh, it's on a space station. It just sits there and doesn't do anything. One, they go to other places all the time in the show, so you really don't have to worry about that. But two, it still has some really great stories, and I think something really awesome to offer the Star Trek franchise. And in fact, a lot of people who didn't watch DS9, but watched TNG, I've talked to them about Deep Space Nine. They've gone and seen it since, and a lot of them then end up really liking the show. And a lot of hardcore Star Trek fans seem to think that this is their favorite Star Trek show. It's usually between TNG and Deep Space Nine, but a lot of the ones I know who are like really into Star Trek, they play all the video games, they get all the collectibles, all that stuff. Usually I see that Deep Space Nine is their favorite. And I think a lot of that is because the universe building in the show is, I think, some of the strongest. Deep Space Nine as a space station is really cool. The expansion of what lies in the Gamma Quadrant, the Dominion, is a really fascinating idea, and how that affects the Alpha Quadrant. You get to see expansions on the Klingons and their society a lot in this series, which I like a little bit more how they handle the Klingons here than in TNG. I think at this point I had warmed up to the idea that Klingons might not all have been as honorable as they said, but I find their episodes are actually a lot more fascinating here. Getting to see the Cardassians, they're one of my favorite races. Same as the Jem'Hadar, I like them a lot. The Jem'Hadar are a race that's really inspired me. When I used to do Star Trek fan fiction and authoring Foundry missions and Star Trek Online, a lot of my story inspiration came from Deep Space Nine, and a lot of my stories involved the Jem'Hadar because I just liked their concept of a race. They look cool. The idea that they're like servants to these founders, and you have to debate whether or not they're serving them out of a drug addiction or because they really do believe they are gods, or a combination of the two, I just find is really fascinating. And the idea of maybe some of them rebelling against them were stories I wanted to tell in my own writing. Then the whole idea of Section 31, I think that's a really interesting idea. I draw a lot of parallels between the Federation and the United States, because the original series kind of treated it that way, though when you look at it, Federation really isn't the United States. But the way in practice, I think there's some parallels you can have there, where in Deep Space Nine you kind of see the Federation has this ideal, but you see there's some elements of it that don't hold that ideal. And I think you can draw some comparisons with that and the United States in some aspects of it, and in some of the governments or operational thing. I think you can see the similarities between the Federation and some of the agencies in it, and the United States and some of its agencies, and how they say they have this one ideal, but they're willing to break it to promote that ideal, or at least the security of that institution. And so I think that was a really interesting aspect to see in Deep Space Nine. It had stories that were the same as it had stories that were like the same as Next Gen and the original series, but they did explore a little darker substances. But for people who say this show is really dark, I don't know, maybe it's just because of modern storytelling. I don't see it as much that way. It does cover darker subjects, but I see it still trying to do the same thing in a way that Next Gen was doing. But it had more of a focus on, hey, the decisions we make in this area for one episode will have consequences in future episodes. And I think that was something that TNG was lacking for me, is they'd handle something one week and then they'd fly off and not have to deal with it again, which is fine because then you get to tackle a lot of different stories. But there's something about how Deep Space Nine handles that, where there are consequences for the characters' actions that make it a really interesting saga to follow from season one all the way to the end of the show. I like that they handle it as a series, and it's interesting that you do kind of have to watch Deep Space Nine from beginning to end, but it's not like a show like, let's say, Stranger Things, where it's a show that you have to watch every episode to get the whole story. There are individual episodes throughout Deep Space Nine that are standalone, but they end up making this bigger universe, and they do tie to other episodes. So it's not something you have to watch in order, but I do recommend it. I know people who have watched the show out of order and still really enjoyed it. I don't get how, because I enjoyed the story from beginning to end. But hey, you do you. I always try to understand what drew me to Deep Space Nine so much, especially at a young age, because at a young age, I actually had not seen a lot of Deep Space Nine. It wasn't the last Star Trek series I saw, but it was towards the end. And I definitely liked Star Trek before seeing Deep Space Nine. But even before I watched a majority of it, I liked the idea of the show. And I think a lot of that has to go with the Star Trek games I played as a kid. And I played a lot of the Deep Space Nine games. The two that stand out to me is Star Trek Deep Space Nine The Fallen and Star Trek Deep Space Nine Dominion Wars. Looking back on it, Dominion Wars is a really crappy game, but I liked playing that game, and I think that's where I got my fascination with all these races, because it was cool to think and imagine about them. So then I wanted to watch the actual show to see what they were like, and I think they handle it really well. It is a war story eventually, but they build that up, and I think they handle it well. I know some people might disagree, but I like how they handled that. So again, like Next Gen, it's really hard for me to pull out individual episodes and say this one was great, this one was great, because I like so many of them. Unlike all the other Star Trek series, I am okay watching season 1 and 2 of Deep Space Nine. It has some lackluster episodes, but I think it's because it's my favorite show. I'm able to sit down and watch those and enjoy them a lot more than, say, Voyager season 1 and 2. I can see where people might skip over 1 and 2 and say, they're bad, they're blah. They're definitely not as good as the later on seasons of Star Trek Deep Space Nine. But I find they're still watchable for me. Definitely season 1, though, they still try to tie it a lot to TNG and bring in guest stars. But as you get later on, there are a lot of really strong episodes. And the thing I like about Deep Space Nine is they do a much better job, I feel, handling each of the characters in the show. And they're the characters I relate to more than any of the other Star Trek shows. This would be a super long video to talk about them all, but there's something about each of them that I like. Quark is one of my favorites in the show. Dax definitely was a big inspiration to me on the show. Garrick is definitely one of the best guest starring characters in Star Trek. He's up there with Q for me, but I think in a way Garrick wins because he's definitely the more interesting character, and a lot of people seem to really like Garrick. And I think it's well deserved. I think it was definitely the right call to bring back this character who was supposed to be on once. He definitely almost becomes a main character in a way. He starts to show up a lot. Hell, even characters like Jake Sisko, a lot of people, I think Star Trek handles writing kids and teenagers really poorly. Especially Wesley. He's not the best written, especially when other characters have to deal with him. I definitely get the hate from people, and I somewhat agree with it. I like how they handled Jake Sisko a lot more. For whatever reason, I think he had better quality writing than Wesley in this show, which definitely helps. They do some really great two-parters in this show as well. One of my favorite episodes out of the show is the two-parter Past Tense. It is a time travel story that kind of talks about Earth dealing with pretty much homelessness, wealth inequality, that type of stuff, and how you treat that. And it's a really powerful episode to kind of show, because it takes place in 2020, like 2026 or something like that, and it's not terribly far off, and it's not terribly different from the world we live in now. It's something you can easily look at and go, I can see us turning into that. And it's just a really strong two-parter that I find really relatable and had a really good message to send, I think, to people. A lot of these episodes have really great messages to send, and I think growing up, this built a lot of my character. One of the episodes, Rejoined, was their episode that they tackled same-sex relationships and that issue. And I remember as a kid, I wasn't for that. I was like, eh. I thought it was weird. I think a lot of kids did too, especially at my time growing up. And that was an episode, though, like when I watched it, it treated it as like, the episode's not really about that, at least in universe. It's dealing with so the Trill live multiple lifespans, and you're not allowed to have a relationship with somebody you had a relationship in a past life. And that's what the episode's focusing on. It doesn't really focus on the fact they're the same gender. And I think that's what really tackles that issue well, because by doing that, they're basically saying, this isn't an issue, people, that these two people who are the same sex love each other. So, but because of the place we were at, and we still are at today in our world, it's an issue for many. But the episode handled it brilliantly by saying it's not an issue, so get over it. And I think I definitely took that to heart watching that episode. There's the episode with Cisco in a Pale Moonlight. That one is a really strong episode. I like the way that one's shot. I like the story. I like that it shows a captain having to deal with the Prime Directive getting in the way of a very controversial decision he has to make. And again, the show, I like that it doesn't handle things as black and white, because our world, I don't view it as black and white. It's more gray. Even the main bad guy in Deep Space Nine, or one of them, Gul Dukat, a lot of comparisons are made that he is basically Space Hitler, and I get those comparisons. But I like that the show doesn't handle him like that. He is a bad guy. He turns out to be a bad guy throughout the show. But I like that in the middle of the show, you get to see the good side of him, the more human side. You get to see his human side, where you can start to relate to him. And you start to think, maybe he's redeemable, or at least maybe he's somebody you can actually tolerate. In the end, he's driven by his own lust for power that you see, that kind of ultimately destroys him. But he's definitely one of the more interesting villains of Star Trek to see. He might actually be my favorite. Now, the Ferengi episodes are some of my favorite in Deep Space Nine. Star Trek handles comedy okay from time to time in their shows, but I think the Ferengi episodes nail it. There's this episode where they have to rescue Quark's mom, and it is definitely the funniest episode to me. I love that, especially when there's the scene where where the one Ferengi just shoots his mom because they're like, we weren't gonna rescue her, so I thought I'd put her out of her misery in one of the test scenarios they were running. So I liked those episodes a lot, especially because I think early on the Ferengi that were on Deep Space Nine, even Quark, weren't well developed, but as you get later and later into the show, they are really well written, and I like their stories quite a bit. They do some Mirror Universe episodes. I like the Mirror Universe a lot. Looking back on it, because they kind of get rid of the Terran Empire, I kind of am sad about that, but I like that they did something different with the Mirror Universe to keep it a little fresh. And then the ending of Deep Space Nine. I thought Deep Space Nine had a good beginning. It had a good series premiere. The ending, though, it's a really strong ending. It for what it's worth, TNG, I think, has a better episode overall to end the series. I think it's a more interesting standalone story as well. But I like that Deep Space Nine, its ending is basically the last 10 episodes of the show. But they spend that time they're wrapping up the overall story of the show. They're wrapping up not only the main characters really well and giving them all adequate time to end their stories, but even the guest stars get to end their story. I like that they bring guest stars back that have been reoccurring just to wrap them up. So by the time the show ends and you're flying away from the space station, you pretty much know where characters are at the end of the story. You know where they've ended up, what they're going to probably be doing in the future. Not all of them are a happy ending, but you know what happens to them. And I liked that aspect of Deep Space Nine, especially because those are the characters I loved the most in the show. And so that's something I think, especially Voyager, when I talked about their ending, didn't have. It didn't have a satisfying conclusion for all the characters. And I think that's something Deep Space Nine got right. I like the design of Deep Space Nine. It's a cool looking space station. I love the promenade. Again, it's a place I would want to visit. I'd probably want to live just because to me it's the locations the show took place in, the promenade, operations, all that, they just became iconic to me. And this show just means so much to me. It's a show that I used to rewatch every year because I enjoyed the stories so much. And it's the show that got me into Star Trek as much as it did. It made me go to a Star Trek convention where I got this shirt. It's had me collect all this stuff. It had me play various Star Trek games for a while. It had me podcast for a while on the franchise. And I give a lot of that credit to Deep Space Nine. If it wasn't for this series, I probably would have enjoyed the other Star Trek shows, but I wouldn't be as much of a fan of the franchise as I had been. So Deep Space Nine is a solid installation into the Star Trek series, and I definitely recommend watching it if you did give it a pass. I think it's a show you will really enjoy if you're already a Star Trek fan. So what do you guys think? What are your rankings of the Star Trek series? What did you like in Deep Space Nine? Did you not like it? Why not? Let me know in the comments. If you enjoyed the video, give it a like. Give me a subscribe if you're not subscribed already and you want to see more videos. If you've enjoyed my content and you would like, you can support me on Patreon. The link is in the description below. Thanks for watching, everybody. All my rankings of the Star Trek series. I might have some more Star Trek videos coming to you soon. I will probably have a review for Star Trek Discovery coming to you soon. Once that show wraps up, I want to do a video on it. So you can expect that in the future. But again, I'll have more videos on other subjects coming up very soon. So be sure to check back soon. I'll catch you guys next time. Later.